Hello everyone, welcome to Osara Psych, and today I wanted to go over some of the differences between the INTP and INTJ personality types. Now, if you've been with my channel since the very beginning, you'll actually know that my very first video was on the differences between the INTJ and the INTP personality types, but I thought it might be interesting to kind of revisit this topic and look at it with a new perspective now that it's been some time. Let's get into it. So the major differences between the INTP and the INTJ personality types comes from their cognitive functions, whereas the INTP, despite being an extroverted perceiving type, leads with the dominant introverted judging function, introverted thinking, and they have secondary extroverted perceiving, whereas the INTJ is a dominant introverted perceiving type with secondary extroverted judging. So the INTP is TINE, introverted thinking, extroverted intuition, whereas the INTJ is NITE, introverted intuition with secondary extroverted thinking. So the difference between these two types becomes clear when you see how they solve problems and how they kind of approach the world. So I like to say that the INTP starts with logic and then makes abstractions. They make logical abstractions, whereas the INTJ starts with abstractions and then uses logic to kind of achieve their abstract visions. So the INTP, because they have introverted thinking, wants to build this internal framework of ideas and how things work. Introverted thinking wants to build kind of like this internal library almost, a blueprint internally of how the world works and how information is categorized. Whereas introverted intuition is much more receptive to the world around it and isn't constantly building this system or library of information. It's more so receptive and reactive to the world around it. So as INTPs build this internal system, they use this internal system to create new ideas about the world that they live in. So they start with that logic, they start with the internal system, and then use their extroverted intuition, use their creativity to spawn ideas from what they know. Whereas the INTJ, on the other hand, is kind of imagining something out of the unconscious and then pushing to achieve it. So the INTJ is probably going to be a bit more of a trailblazer when it comes to new ideas, but they may not be as solid in their creation of that idea in terms of how it works or why they need to do it. The INTJ simply just wants to do something and then they push to achieve it. Whereas the INTP is typically interested in a certain topic or field and then has creative thoughts or ideas about that idea or the topics associated with it. They also tend to differ in their preference for extroverted perceiving versus extroverted judging. Because INTPs are extroverted perceiving types with extroverted intuition, they tend to be more so on the creative side of things, but less so in the finishing side of things, and that they might think of or create a new idea or something that they want to do, but they're less likely to want to bring it into the real world to complete it in such a manner like the INTJ would. Whereas the INTJ is going to imagine something that's important to them and they're going to push with all of their willpower to achieve it. And there's a distinct difference in this. Now, the INTP is going to be excessively creative and intelligent in any field that they put themselves into where they genuinely have interest. I personally say that INTPs have the capacity to be the most intelligent type, and I think most of the world's smartest people in history are INTPs. I would type Carl Jung as an INTP, I would type Einstein as an INTP, and that's just kind of their way of engaging with the world. They process all of this information, they learn as much as they can, and they store it and process it internally, creating that internal system, and then they tend to be creative about what they're going to do with that information, or they tend to kind of expand upon the system that they're learning and create new information within it. Whereas the INTJ, on the other hand, tends to imagine something that they want and simply just do whatever they can to get that. The INTJ tends to not just want to learn random information, whereas much as the INTP might want to learn or gather as much information as they can. The INTJ is going to pick a topic and then put all of their resources and energy into learning about that topic until they've gotten what they want out of it. Then they just get rid of that topic or that interest and move on to the next thing. INTJs tend to be very obsessive on one thing at a time and put all of their energy into that one thing. And then they're not as likely to remember things about that topic when it is no longer needed. I think of INTJs as kind of having this more like temporary use for knowledge, where they see knowledge and the realm of thinking as a tool to achieve their vision. Where for the introverted thinking type, the INTP, knowledge is knowledge for the sake of knowledge, and it's not something that they're just using. It's something that they want to know, that they want to collect, like a librarian would be. As I mentioned earlier, the INTP tends to build this internal system that is much like a library. They want to know all that they can know within the fields that they're interested in. You can also see a difference between the two types when you look at the repressed function. So INTJs have repressed extroverted sensing, or INTPs have repressed extroverted feeling. Now, the difference here is that INTPs tend to struggle with kind of gauging the temperature of the room and maintaining the emotional level of everyone there, while the INTJ tends to struggle with being in the moment. And these are two separate things that when you figure out what they mean, they can really help you identify which of these two types you are and work on your struggle areas. So the INTP, because they have repressed extroverted feeling, they don't really care about the feelings of others in most situations in a natural way. They're not the types who are going to naturally be noticing how everyone else in the room is feeling, how they're doing, whether everyone's happy. They're instead going to be more so focused on that internal world of thinking. Whereas the INTJ, on the other hand, since they're in the internal world of ideas, they're going to repress the outer world of sensation, the physical world that they're actually living in. They're going to ignore the world of stimulus. And this tends to lead the INTJ to be very detached. And I would actually say that the INTJ and the INFJ are the most detached of the types, even compared to the INTP. The INTP may be more detached and introverted than many other types, but because they don't repress sensation, they're at least somewhat present in the world. They're still engaging with the actual world. They want to be learning things. They want to be engaging in the learning process. Whereas INTJs, on the other hand, often kind of struggle to even be present because they're so lost in that inner world of images. They're constantly daydreaming. In times of stress, the INTP is far more likely to respond with emotions or outlash than the INTJ would, and that's because they have that repressed extroverted feeling. Since INTPs are the types that don't really like to show their feelings much, they often keep everything in and then it just blows up and they yell at someone. I've actually seen this with many of my introverted thinking dominant friends, and it's not something that they intend to do, but it is something that they have to work on. Especially in the teenage years, a lot of these people that I know would get into very bad situations, and they're the types who would just yell at someone outright. And that's not something you would think of characteristically of a thinking type, but because feeling is repressed, if they haven't learned how to manage that feeling function in times of stress, they're going to respond with it in an extremely unhealthy way. The INTJ, on the other hand, is likely to fall into bad sensory habits, such as overeating or engaging in something of the sensory world that isn't healthy, because they fall into states where they switch off their introverted intuition, they switch off their primary way of engaging, and fall into bad physical habits. Overeating is one that I commonly use in a lot of my other videos, but there are other examples: drinking, drug abuse, things of that nature. Another weakness with the INTJ personality type is that they have an extreme lack of attention to detail, whereas INTPs tend to have a better attention to details than the INTJ does. And the INTP, despite being an extroverted intuitive type, they have that introverted thinking, but they also have introverted sensing in the function stack. So this makes them have an extreme awareness of details when it comes to things that they're interested in, an extreme awareness of detail to the knowledge of topics that they're interested in. But INTJs, on the other hand, always will struggle with the concrete. They're always going to struggle with the matter-of-fact things. They're more so interested in the abstract concepts behind the ideas, and they get frustrated if you come to them with too many details or too many facts. They just want to get to the point. They want to follow their dream, their vision, and they're going to do whatever they can to achieve it using extroverted thinking, but they're also going to ignore the details of how they're achieving it. They're going to be the type that's going to make personal sacrifices that most others wouldn't make in pursuit of their goals and their visions. INTPs are also likely to be the kind of people who like to debate, and that comes from most of the NTP types. NTPs are the debaters, and it's because with introverted thinking, they have this strong preference for making sure that logic in the internal system is correct. And when they notice someone else presents information that is not consistent with their internal framework of logic, then it frustrates them, or they're going to be the first person to kind of point that out and tell that person that they're wrong. And this is because introverted thinking, I'll admit, it does have this preference for wanting to be right. You're going to see that within the NTP types. They like to be right. They like to debate for the most part. Of course, this isn't going to be every NTP, but NTP types overall are the types who are going to be more so interested in kind of showing that they have knowledge and understanding because that's their primary way of engaging with the world. They want the world to know that they've collected this information and that they're good at understanding this information that they've collected. The INTJ, on the other hand, is going to be more so frustrated if you kind of oppose their vision, if you oppose what they want to achieve. Because the INTJ is consistently trying to push towards something, they're not going to care as much whether or not you're wrong. They're going to care about whether or not what you're saying is contradicting with what they want to accomplish. Because if you do that, that's the ultimate sin of being a friend or being with someone who is an INTJ. If you're opposing their goals, you're directly in their way, and they're probably going to ditch you very quickly. But the INTP, on the other hand, is more so concerned with whether or not the thing is logically consistent, whereas the INTJ is just focused on whether or not it's going to help them achieve their goal. Overall, I think both of these types are very interesting. I think the INTP and the INTJ are often the types that are the ones to change the world in some technological way. They're the type to create something new or inventive that kind of changes how we view the world. I think INTJs, because they're a little bit on the more visionary side, are the types who are going to be, again, trailblazers. They're going to think of something in more of its prototype phase and then work towards pushing that out. I always like to think of Nikola Tesla when I think of INTJs, because he had all these wild and crazy ideas, and a large majority of them didn't really work. But they were extremely interesting, and he was way ahead of his time in terms of what he was thinking about. But then came along people after him who kind of took the ideas, brought them into a more so grounded state of reality, and then perfected them. And I would say that the people who perfected these ideas were the ones who were introverted thinking type, because they really put thought into how these things work instead of trying to achieve them without really putting much attention into the detail of how they work. All right, those are some subtle differences between the INTJ and the INTP personality type. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you've learned something new. I would like to say that I am still doing typing sessions and coaching and all those types of things. You can check out my website at sarahpsych.com. This has been Asara at Asara Psych. Have a good one.